Zealanders investing
the member's time is
in that
expired.
company.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This government is engaged in a consistent attack on basic democratic rights. It is a Muldoonist-type government, which is something I said back in June, and since then pretty much a week doesn't go by then proves me to be right. I think it was very useful. The Economist gave an editorial about democracy and majoritarianism on June this year. And I quote from The Economist. They said, "Majoritarianism, the credo of an expanded group of elected but autocratic rulers around the world, which holds that electoral might always makes you right, is not true democracy." And it is one of the fundamental principles of this government that all they need to do is get a single majority vote, a single vote majority in this House, and they can ram through anything, whether it's asset sales against the will of the vast majority, whether it's mass surveillance under the GCSB bill, which they'll be attempting to do this afternoon. A single vote majority is enough for them to force this through. But majoritarianism, the idea that electoral might makes you always right, is not true democracy, as The Economist pointed out. Independent courts and free media are a critical part of that. And yet this government has consistently attacked those basic democratic rights and freedoms. Think about the Prime Minister's response to the Human Rights Commission when the Human Rights Commission dared to threaten the government's GCSB bill. The Prime Minister threatened to cut their funding. That is the reality of modern-day democracy in New Zealand. The Prime Minister said, "You disagree with me, I'll cut your funding." Think about the Henry inquiry. The Prime Minister's inquiry went after journalists' movement records in this building. The Prime Minister's inquiry went after ministers' email records and got them. The Prime Minister's inquiry went after journalist records and got them. This is the kind of government that we have that is engaged in consistent attacks on democratic rights and principles. Think about the right to access the courts. In a democracy, a deep democracy, a resilient democracy, people would have the right to go to court to challenge the lawfulness of government actions. This government is consistently removing your right to go to court to challenge them. If you think about the Carers Bill, that was purposely put in place so that those people can no longer go to the courts to challenge whether the government is acting in a lawful manner. The independent judiciary haven't been abolished by John Key. He simply made them inaccessible to the citizens so they can no longer get there. They have done a similar thing with the Environmental Protection Authority, or really the Environmental Pollution Authority, which removes the right to access the Environment Court. Instead, it ends up in the EPA, which simply rubber stamps it all. Think about the government's actions in Canterbury. This was before the earthquake, when they removed the right of Cantabrians to elect their regional council. And the reason they removed that right was because the elected regional council was doing too much to protect the environment and was insufficiently pro-irrigation. That was the reason why John Key removed democracy for the people in Christchurch and Canterbury. Think about the government's actions in removing the right to protest at sea, the Anadarko Amendment, an amendment which came after Simon Bridges' meeting with the oil industry. That is removing people's right to protest at sea. If you think about the history of nuclear-free New Zealand, how did we end up with nuclear-free New Zealand? It was people like that protesting at sea against the US submarines and frigates that were visiting our country. The government is consistently and persistently attacking basic democratic rights like the right to protest. If we think about the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, the government is refusing to release the text or any information about New Zealand's position to the New Zealand public, even though that information is being made available to the other governments with which New Zealand is negotiating. Those other governments know more about the negotiating position of the New Zealand government than New Zealand citizens do themselves. Think about the MMP review. MMP won in the referendum. There was supposed to be an independent review by the independent umpire, which was the Electoral Commission, who came back with a series of recommendations. The National Party and John Key rejected every single one of them for pure partisan political reasons, because it didn't suit them to actually improve MMP as was recommended by the independent umpire. And of course then we come to the GCSB bill. This bill which enables the GCSB to engage in mass surveillance of New Zealanders, which the government pushed through under urgency, and this afternoon they're going to try to push through again. This government has a consistent approach. It attacks democratic rights at every turn.
Members Thomas. The Honourable Amy Adams.